Okay then. So why don't we begin? And the beginning line is what was the last line on last week's page, and we'll still go back to this issue of apostleship. But the last line on the page there was the first line here: when the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. So just little bit of background. Pentecost, for those that aren't entirely familiar, is the Hebrew Chag HaShavuot. Shavuot literally means weeks, and it reflects the law of counting the omer, the measure of grain, from the first barley that is cut, and then onto the wheat. It is 7 times 7 week period from the second day of Passover, although there is a great debate 2,000 years ago as to exactly when you start the count. According to the Pharisees, this count was on the second day of Passover, and according to the Sadducees and the Baitusim, were probably the Samaritans and other groups, you began on the first, after the first Sabbath after Pesach. One way or another, it was roughly a 7 week period, and hence the name is Shavuot. In the Hebrew Bible, the holiday is only for the purpose, only as the reason of harvesting, of celebrating the harvest and the first fruits. Until that time, most of the grain had been cut, and then began the time of the tree fruit season through the summer and all the way through the holiday of Sukkot, of tabernacles or booths. And those are the 3 pilgrimage holidays: Passover, Pentecost / Shavuot, and Sukkot / tabernacles or booths. And at the primary level, the fundamental level, at least so say most biblical scholars of the late 19th, and 20th century, it's all about agriculture. The beginning of the harvest, the midway point of the harvest, and the end of the harvest. That's food. That's the greatest relationship with God. And then after the harvest festival in the fall, come the rains and praying for the rains. But at some point, another layer was added, or maybe parallel at the same time. It doesn't have to be linear, in that Passover became the holiday about the Exodus from Egypt. Tabernacles is said in the Torah that it's the holiday to commemorate the 40 years of wandering in booths, even though there were tents, but let's give them that leeway. But Shavuot is not mentioned as the holiday depicting or in commemorating the giving of the law at Sinai until the late first millennium BC, right? It's not mentioned in the biblical writings in the Hebrew Bible, but it is mentioned in some of the pseudo-epigraphical writings. So, for instance, the Book of Jubilees mentions that as a reason. That's probably 2nd century BCE, a Jewish source. And then in the time of rabbinic literature, it's assumed that Shavuot commemorates the giving of the law at Sinai. So the people of Israel, they left in the first month of the year in that spring, and then 2 months later or so, they received the Torah. A little bit less than 2 months, they received the Torah at Sinai. Although that's not written in Scripture. But if you ask any Jewish kid who has a Jewish upbringing, that's what they'll tell you. Shavuot is all about the giving of the law at Sinai. Unless they grew up in a kibbutz or a non-religious farming community in Israel, then what they'll tell you, it's about the first fruits and the celebrating of the different kinds of first fruits of that community on Shavuot, and wearing white. And then already in the second half of the 20th century, it became, for children of Israel, the holiday of water, where you would have water fights. Really interesting. Not sure exactly how that happened, other than the fact that it comes close to when school is over. And so you see in the streets of Israel, if you've ever been there for Shavuot, there are kids throwing water bombs at each other, water balloons and water bags at each other. Okay. So that's the background of Pentecost. Now, the way that it's celebrated, it's a 1-day holiday in the land of Israel, and for Reform Jews, it's a 2-day holiday for those that live in the diaspora, conservative and Orthodox Jews. And it's celebrated by reading the passages in the synagogue of the giving of law at Sinai. And I have to believe that's in the background here as well. That the background of this celebration of Pentecost, the setting of the stage for what's going to happen, is the giving of the law at Sinai. And so there's no matzah to eat. Although the later custom is to eat dairy food, but there's no matzah or bitter herbs to eat as there is in Passover. There's no sukkah booth to be in, or holding the palm frond and the other tree pieces of trees in your hands as there is during the holiday of Sukkot. And so in the Middle Ages, there began a custom, the Kabbalists in Sfat began a custom of staying up all night and learning Torah, studying Torah all night long, because of a midrashic tradition that says that while God was busy explaining the details of the law to Moses on Sinai, the Israelites fell asleep. And so in order to correct that, we stay up all night. And so now, I'm not proposing they stayed up all night here, but I am proposing, though, that this was not just a celebration of the harvest. 7 weeks beforehand, was Jesus's death and resurrection, and so this figures into the story somewhat. Stephen? Is there any before we actually read this chapter? Is there any other background that we should know about, New Testament point of view, as far as Pentecost is concerned?
No, I think that's right. I think just to take one step back, we see that the temple has been destroyed, Herod's temple, and we're in 80, 10 years later, and here we have the community of Luke in Antioch, mostly Hellenistic Jews, trying to grapple with and make sense of Jesus, of Jesus as a Jew, Jesus being a Jew and being a believer in Jesus as the long-awaited one, the Messiah, who was raised from death. Right? So you've got resurrection, you've got the messianic piece. And so these Hellenistic Jews of the diaspora are trying to understand this in the context of their own faith tradition. And so they ransack the ancient scriptures, especially the Septuagint, and try to, as in verse 12, as Pentecost came, as the as they begin to hear in their own language, they ask one another, what does this mean? And then basically the rest of Acts unpacks that. So it is, in fact, I think a very potent image, the giving of the law, the establishing of the primal covenant with the people of God at Sinai in Exodus 19-ish. And then there's smoke and there's fire that accompanies that. So this seems to clearly resonate with the giving of the covenant, or the renewal of the covenant, or the establishing of a new covenant. And so all that imagery is there. And what are they receiving? What are they being given? Well, it's a Torah. It's a new Torah. It's of the Spirit, but that connects, as we'll soon see when we get into it, with the apocalyptic, eschatological element, that this is the beginning of the end of the age. This is the long-awaited age to come has broken in the midst of this age, and something new is going on. So that to me is how I'm framing it for my own self.
Paradigm shift, if you will. I'm going to take issue with one word that you used, that they would ransack the tradition, the biblical scriptures. I would say they were mining. I'm sure you'd agree with me. They're mining the biblical scripture for inspiration, right? Ransacks, it could have the connotation that maybe they're misusing. And as some of the debates I have with local clergy, who are all progressive, is very often one will say, oh, the real meaning of that scripture is, and I'll say, no, that is a meaning, and it's a meaning we like, but I don't know, not everything is linear as well, right? Not everything develops in one direction, of course, right? So yeah, great way of putting it. And there is a paradigm shift which is about to happen. But when these folks who are writing, you're giving the historical background of the composition of this book, when they're writing, do you assume that they're thinking of the temple still standing?
No, I mean,
Be,
I mean, given that that this is rooted historically in the 30s, before the temple, long before the temple was destroyed, but they're writing, they're cobbling together these sources into the form we now have 10 years or so after the temple has been destroyed. So they know it's not there. So in light of that comes the interpretation of the historical piece. But again, it's not, and I don't know that this needs to be said to this group, but it's not, they're not writing history per se as a journalist might. They're not recording events. They're interpreting an experience of God in their community in a way that tries to make sense of this new understanding.
yeah, my question perhaps was because it doesn't say they're meeting up in the temple. Right? It purports to happen before the destruction of the temple, but it does say they're all together in one place, kind of leaving it ambiguous, right? I think maybe we'll understand that they were in somebody's house afterwards. They're maybe a private house, but in any case, they're not in the temple. The narrative doesn't say they're in the temple. But in the background of this story, one also has to know another thing, is that Jews from all over the diaspora would come to Jerusalem for these pilgrimage festivals. And in general, Jews from all over the diaspora would live and stay on in Jerusalem, so much so that Jerusalem was really considered to be the center of the world, right, from a Jewish point of view. And it is, there are in various times, not so much in biblical literature, but in post-biblical literature, and certainly as we go on in the mid-first millennium, traditions about Jerusalem being the navel of the world, the Omphalos concept, right? That's where and Jerusalem, the temple, the stone in the Holy of Holies is the stone from which the rest of the world was created. It's the foundation stone, and so there's this idea of Jerusalem being the center. So imagine one of those maps that you've seen probably that has Jerusalem in the center of the map, and the whole world spreads out that way. Okay. So why don't we read the first paragraph and we begin our commentary. Were there any comments that somebody wanted to ask about the sources that I asked you to look on your own? If you did, the rabbinic sources about sending people, being an apostle. We're going to go back to that. I think that's going to walk with us the whole way. I'll just give my bottom line. My working assumption is, and I'm not that great of a scholar to state this as a dictum, but the word apostle that would be in Hebrew was not used about the prophets in biblical literature. They could have been, but the idea, the concept is similar. And in rabbinic literature, you hear a little bit about it, about Moses and Elijah, but not about all the prophets. So not all the prophets. It would not be correct to say apostles, the way used in this book, are like prophets used in the Hebrew in the Hebrew scripture. I don't think that would be a good parallel. What's parallel in the time of the writing of the book of Acts is the language used that we know from rabbinic sources, from Pharisaic that became rabbinic sources, that use the word shaliach that I mentioned last week. Shaliach is probably the best translation of, or apostle is the best translation of shaliach, or that's what lies in the back, except for we don't have, very, very rarely is there a source that has a leader being sent by another leader, and I brought one source like that, called a shaliach. Mostly, I'm guessing 98% plus of the usage of the word shaliach in Talmudic literature has to do with business. When somebody is an agent of somebody else, is represented to somebody else, and there's an ongoing debate depending on the particular topic, in legal topic, There's an ongoing debate as to whether the person who is sent has the same status as the person who sent that person, right? And that, I think, is in the background here. I think this idea, the semantic question in people's mind, is the apostle the same as Jesus? Is it an extension? Who gets to make another apostle? What are the conditions? That fascinates me. Who gets to be an apostle? Is it only people who experience Jesus in Jesus' lifetime, which I think is a pretty common view? But then, of course, Paul didn't, but Paul has an exception, because he had his own experience with Jesus. So those, to me, that's one of the interesting questions here. Who gets to send? What is their authority or their authenticity as an apostle? And any connections, any comments on that before we go on?
Islam has a different view on some of these. They have two categories. One is Nabi, the Hebrew Navi, which is a prophet. And the next word is Rasul, which is an apostle or a messenger. And they describe Prophet Muhammad as a Rasul, someone who brings a message to you.
Right. Okay. So we're going to go back to that issue of language and hearing God's word and things like that as we read. So would somebody like to read the first section? Please go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The coming of the Holy Spirit. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages, as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jews from every people under heaven living in Jerusalem. And at this sound, the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us, in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. In our own languages, we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power." All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others sneered and said, "They are filled with new wine."
Okay. So any initial, why don't you, are there any initial remarks that you'd like to make? You read something?
Well, this is just so familiar. You hear it every year. It's I because I've heard people speaking in tongues. I always wonder about this, that these people would hear in whatever language they spoke. That's what they heard and understood. And it just fascinates me. I think that speaking in tongues is an incredible gift. But
Okay, someone else before we kind of dig into the academic levels? Rita Claire?
I have a little bit of a problem about speaking in tongues, quite honestly. So I don't know what to say about that. Maybe Bill can, because he's had more experience with that. Can you say something about that?
Well, whoever gives the tongue, somebody has to give a translation. And sometimes that can get confusing on who wants to do the translation.
So I think in our passage here, though, there was no translator necessary. That's part of the miracle, right? Everybody seemed to be understanding others. My understanding of the simple meaning is that, and I would love to go to a church where they speak in tongues just to see what it's about. I didn't even really know about it until I got to the United States and I've read about it in different situations. But I kind of like to experience it. It seems like an interesting thing in the same way that I've experienced, a Hindu ceremony in a temple and obviously in Buddhism and other Christian. But I think the text here is pretty clear, is that they're speaking not in languages that are imagined languages or languages that are foreign to us, angelic languages. They're speaking in regular languages from all these places in the world, and it takes a tour around the world where there was a diaspora of Jews, and they're all coming back. And that's the miraculous thing, I think, is that the coming together of that language is no longer a barrier. It seems to be a great blessing in this and a communal experience.
I have been in churches where somebody decided they were going to be the one that gave the designated tongue, and then another person decided they were going to give the designated interpretation. And sometimes somebody else might have had a gift of interpretation and they were scrubbed out. Mm-hmm. So speaking in tongues can be a gift or it can be a confusion.
Okay. Well, and I think, Bill, as David just said, this is not an ecstatic these are not angelic languages. These are languages that those who speak these languages recognize that they're being spoken to. But don't you think, David, this kind of is a reversal of the Tower of Babel, where they were confused, and now it's kind of a coming back into understanding where they recognize what's being said to each other?
Yeah, absolutely. And that has a message unto itself. And that has a message as far as the ethnocentric the entocentric aspect of it being a Jewish experience, because the Tower of Babel, of course, goes even before Abraham, and it's bringing back a state to the world. Absolutely, that I feel is in the background from a bit. But there's another verse that we're going to get to Joel in a second, but there's another verse. If you could go to the third page that I sent out. If people have it, if not, I can throw it up. We call this prophet Zephaniah. I'm guessing it's something like Zephaniah in English. Zephaniah is one of the smaller prophets in the 12 minor prophets, and this passage, when I came across this in the 80s, has always stuck with me because of the Hebrew, well, I'll say it again. So for then I will make the peoples pure of speech, so that they will all invoke the Lord by name and serve the Lord with one accord. And this comes up in our prayer, our Jewish prayer. In Hebrew, safa brura, and that caught my attention because from the Orthodox world, there were that was a term that was used for the titles of books. Speak clear speaking. Safa is tongue. And interesting the play on words that we have on Acts here with the tongues of fire and the tongues. I didn't go back to the Greek. My intention was to go back to the Greek and see if one can trace that same play on words with tongues of fire as well as far as the human tongue as well. But Safabru, a clear vision of speech, and this is a vision for the future. So, Steve, before, and you were talking about, you mentioned apocalyptic and eschatologic. Could you just briefly define those terms for our folks here and make sure we're all on the same page?
Yeah. As I understand it, from my own background and understanding, there was this sense that the coming of Messiah would usher in the long-awaited age to come, the heavenly age, or or the age that would be under Messiah's rule, as opposed to being in this age under the rule of the Satan, the adversary, the accuser. And so as the early Christians experienced this, they had to kind of figure out, well, is that age to come? Is this it? I mean, people are still suffering and dying, and evil is still rampant. So did we misread the memo? How do we make sense of this? And I think they came to an appreciation of Jesus as Messiah, that they came to embrace as Messiah, ushered in the age to come, inaugurated it, started it, but it's not consummated. So basically the apostolic era, or the era of the church, they're in that in-between time. And the new age, the coming age under Messiah has started, but it's not yet finished. And so, you know, I think it's helpful when I heard years ago the idea of D-Day and V-Day. You know, at D-Day at Normandy, effectively Hitler's back was broken. The outcome was all but certain, but they still had to make it to Berlin, and it took 11 months of deadly fighting before it was finished. So that in-between time is understood to be the last days. The last days are upon us. And as we'll see in Yoel, in verse 17, I don't want to jump ahead, but just to reference it now, the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew, adds, in the last days, it will be, God declares. And yet, as I don't think that's in the Masoretic or the Hebrew text. I think it just says, and it will come to pass, or something like that. So it's an intentional movement by the New Testament writers to say we are in the end days. The age to come is upon us.
From a Jewish point of view, the best example of this kind of literature that many of us studied together last year is the book of Daniel. And I'm sure some of you have seen it as well. And the end part of Daniel, not the first stories, but the latter half, the second half, being in that period right now. And there's others as well. You know, the idea of having the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew, the Masoretic text, the accepted traditional Hebrew text, there are differences, and there's also differences between the Hebrew text of the Masoretic text and the Dead Sea Scroll text that we have. And quite often, the Dead Sea Scroll fragments we have will agree with the Septuagint, which means the Septuagint didn't change the text. It was echoing a forlaga, a text in front of it that was different. And we need to get used to that fact that just because we have a Hebrew text that's printed in Bibles today, or even if we have a manuscript from 1,000 years ago, or edition, that doesn't mean that was the original text. There were multiple Hebrew texts. The best example of that is the book of Jeremiah. The Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls that we have fragments of, they reflect a text which is 5/8 the size of the Hebrew text that we have. There's that many additions to it. And the additions there in the Hebrew text always add Babylonia as the enemy, whereas in the other ones, the enemy will come from the north. That's just an example I remember off the top of my head. So we don't, in other words, Stephen, it's not necessarily that the New Testament writers changed the earlier text. There could have been another version they were using. Or they could have known two versions, but they chose the one that they chose. Yeah. Richard, you had wanted to say something beforehand, and then I wanted to call you.
I was going to speak about tongues and just my own experience of going to when I was going to churches, and there's also isn't there a provision? It's not here, but about picking up snakes and things. I mean, isn't there other passages in the New Testament that talk about speaking in tongues as being ecstatic? Because I remember that, but this is clearly different. This is hearing, like you said, it was people speaking their own native language and someone who didn't speak it understanding it, which is different than tongues, where someone speaks in an ecstatic language and then someone in the group interprets it.
There's a parallel to this in Corinthians, correct? Am I mistaken? But I don't remember what it.
Yeah, that's a question.
Well, I mean, 1 Corinthians 13, if someone speaks in the tongues of angels but has not love, then it's just a bunch of bullshit.
Oh, okay, yeah. Because I remember too reading an article in this is maybe 4 decades ago in Psychology Today, where an academic did an analysis of a few churches speaking in tongues, and found that the person who was speaking in tongues only used sounds in from their own native language, and all languages have sounds in them that aren't repeated in other languages, which is part of the reason it makes it difficult to learn a new language. But this academic found that in the particular church where the analysis was being done, that the people who are speaking in tongues, that the sounds in those languages, those angelic languages, coincidentally only had sounds from their own native language, whatever that means.
Coincidentally.
I will say, as a person who, an English speaker who learned another language as a teenager and achieved a very high level of language, Hebrew, the older Americans in my congregation in Tel Aviv, they would say, when I had an Israeli colleague or guest, they would say, "We understand exactly what you're saying, and our Hebrew is good, but we don't understand the Israeli-born fellow as much." And it wasn't because of vocabulary. I learned with time it was because of the music, the intonation, much of what Richard just said, the kinds of sounds one uses in the language. And I found the same thing when I lived in Sweden for 4 years. The Swedish of former Americans, like the former chief rabbi, my predecessor is the chief rabbi, who was born in the United States, and the cantor, when they spoke Swedish, I could follow almost everything. But when native Swedes spoke, it was much harder for me to understand. There's something in the music. I think somebody wanted to say something. Jim, did you want to say something?
There's a question here on Zephaniah, and I did not go back and read the context, but starts out here in verse 19. "For then I will make the peoples pure of speech." So I'm wondering what led up to that, because then it says, so that they may invoke the Lord by name. And I remember quite clearly that the historical Jewish folks could not invoke the Lord by name. That hence the acronym Yahweh, if I remember correctly, because you did not speak the name of the Lord.
Right, good question.
Yeah.
So what repeats this in Zephaniah is the end of days. We're talking about in the end of days. And the issue of not using God's name, first of all, this is a poetic way of saying that everybody will recognize that Adonai, Yud He Vav He, as you said, YWHW. I try not to say the name just out of habit, but is the one God as opposed to recognizing other gods as well. That's kind of a euphemism for that. But the prohibition about saying God's name is not biblical, really. It's more of a post-biblical kind of a thing in the Jewish tradition, right? So if you would, Jim, perhaps you could read for us number 2 on the additional, the sheet from the Hebrew Bible and Rabbinic Literature from the Babylonian Talmud, Shabbat 88b. This is a tractate. The Talmud is, when
Okay.
the Babylonian Talmud is a gathering, an anthology of a collection of oral traditions that were molded around the Mishnah, which we don't have today. We have at other times, which is from the 3rd century. And then the next few centuries, these were discussions that happened in Babylonia, but often quoting Palestinian or Land of Israel rabbis. And it gets kind of edited around the year 600 or so, between 5 and 600. And and it's broken down into volumes. This is the volume that ostensibly talks about the Sabbath, laws of the Sabbath, but it's it goes off on tangents all the time. So I brought you this passage, this is a rabbinic tradition you find in many different examples of early rabbinic literature. Go ahead.
With regard to the revelation at Sinai, Rabbi Yohanan said, "What is the meaning of that which is written? Quote, the Lord gives the word, the women that proclaim the tidings are a great host," end quote. And that comes from Psalm. It means that each and every utterance that emerged from the mouth of the Almighty divided into 70 languages, a great host. And similarly, the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught with regard to the verse, quote, "Behold, is my word not like fire, declares the Lord, and like a hammer that shatters a rock," end quote, from Jeremiah. Just as this hammer breaks a stone into several fragments, so too each and every utterance that emerged from the mouth of the Holy One, blessed be he, divided into 70 languages.
Now, the text that we find this in is later than the authors of the Acts. So I'm not saying there's a direct relationship, but this is part of the oral tradition, the tradition that at Sinai languages were spoken. It's not in the Torah itself, but and flames of in other words, we can tell that Acts, the author of Acts, he drew from the same spring. He drew from the same literary spring that this tradition appears at. And the idea at Sinai was that everybody understood, everybody heard it, everybody was part of the covenant. Now, I say everybody with the reservation that the women were not there. The men had to leave, stay away from their women for 3 days, and that automatically sets aside those 3, despite the verse from Psalms, but you see what the rabbis are doing is what the author of Acts is going to do as well, take different verses from different passages in Hebrew Bible to create a new narrative or a slightly different narrative. And there's another one. Richard, would you read the number 3 as well?
Okay, there we go. Number 3. Rav Yosef said, "What is the verse from which it is derived that they, future Gentiles, will convert? For then will I turn to the peoples a pure language, that they may all call upon the name of the Lord to serve him with one consent." Abaya said to him, "But perhaps it is only from idol worship that they will withdraw, while they will still engage in forbidden sexual relations, including bestiality." Rabbi Yosef said to him, "That cannot be, as it is written at the conclusion of the verse, to serve him with one consent, which indicates that the Gentiles will accept all of God's mitzvot."
Now, this is happening in the 4th century in Babylonia, this particular conversation. But I bring it because there is a knowledge, and this pertains to our topic of why we're having this study together. It belies an assumption that in the end of days, just like Zephaniah and other prophets will say, the nations of the world will admit that there's only one God. That is the mission of the Hebrew Bible, to spread that covenant to all of humanity. Except for the rabbis, the leadership, they have, but are they really going to do it? Aren't they still going to be involved? Because we all know, and I hate to repeat the term bestiality again, but they went low. It's a low blow, right? Fine. But we know, then are they really going to? And then in other words, yes, they're absolutely going to. And the reason I brought this one is because this is the flip side. We often, first of all, we're going to be talking about born Jews, converted Jews, the issue of conversion and spreading this word. That's what the book of the Acts of Apostles are about. But this tension between, on one hand, wanting universalism, but being stuck in a particularistic mode of thinking and feeling about non-Jews, for instance. And any responses, reactions to this?
David, I just wanted to, you touched on a couple of things, but up in verse 10 of Acts chapter 2, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, parts of Libya, blah, blah, blah. It says both Jews and proselytes. So I take it that Judaism was evangelical, was seeking to convert the ethne as well. Is that right? Or welcoming the outsider into the covenant through circumcision?
Yeah, it's a tricky question. There's no one answer to it. Yes, and I had meant to bring this, and I'm going to bring it up on the screen for just a second. I'd forgotten that I wanted to bring the quintessential text on proselytization or / conversion. Give me just one moment, please. Okay, can everybody see that? So this is from the language and the form, the literary form that we have, although it's from the Babylonian Talmud, which was edited much later, this is from the first material from the first few centuries of the Common Era. So more or less contemporary. And this is one view of a number of views our rabbis have taught. A foreigner, that is, I use the word foreigner, but a Gentile could be used as, who expresses a desire to convert in these times, we say to him, in these times is under Roman dominion, okay? What have you seen that would make you want to convert? Do you not know that the Jewish people in these days are downtrodden, pushed around, dragged around, all mixed up, and are generally living through painful circumstances? Like, are you crazy? You want to be Jewish? If he says, I know this, and taking all into consideration, and I'm not even worthy, we accept him immediately. And we talk to him about a few of the minor mitzvot commandments and about a few of the major mitzvot commandments. The examples would be things like, a major one would be Shabbat and eating kosher. A minor might be the clothes, mixing wool and flax. And about some of the punishments for those who transgress the mitzvot. And we say to him, you should know that until now, if you were to eat chalev, which is the fat, the suet, it's called S-U-E-T, the fat, or desecrate the Shabbat, nothing would happen to you. But now, if you eat chalev, you will be punished by the punishment of being cutting off. It's called karet. And if you desecrate Shabbat, you'll be stoned. And in the same way that we tell them about the punishments, we also tell them about the rewards. World to come, long life, etc. But we don't try to teach him too much, and we don't get nitpicky with him. You can tell this is my translation, right? It's a idiomatic translation. If he accepts, we have him circumcised immediately. And when he's well again, we have him immersed immediately with 2 scholars standing nearby. Immersed, that is, baptized, right? Standing nearby, repeating the details of some of the commandments, the mitzvot. From the middle, he comes up from the immersion. He is a Jew in every way, and the fact that text talked about it was versed in males, but it talks about males, but the same thing about women. There's just no circumcision. That's one view. This is another view in the Talmud here. Mar said, one of the later scholars, a foreigner who has come to convert, we say to him, what have you seen, etc. He's quoting that text that we had beforehand, and you tell him a little bit of the mitzvot. What is the reason that if he decides to withdraw from the process that we let him go? Because of Rav Chelbo, who said, converts are as injurious to Israel as a scab. As it is written, and the stranger shall join himself with them, and they shall cleave to the house of Jacob, and it's a play on words, cleaving and the same word for scab. And then Rashi in the Middle Ages understands it, says the reason was because when we find that converts they don't behave properly, they're not real converts. There are 2 parallel tracks in Judaism. There are those that say we should not proselytize at all, and those that say absolutely we should. In the time of the Maccabees, so that is the 2nd century BC, there were forced conversions. The nation of Palmyra was mentioned during the ISIS incursions and the wars. Palmyra, or Tadmor in Hebrew, was an entire nation that converted to Judaism in the 2nd century BCE by force under the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees. There were other cases as well, and there's different levels of conversion. The rabbis distinguish between those who are converts of a Ger Tzedek, a righteous convert, and those who are lions converts, based on a really strange story in the Book of Kings where the exiles in when the Assyrians conquered the northern part of the tribes, they exchanged exiles, and they weren't worshiping in the northern Bethel. They weren't worshiping properly, so a plague of lions came and ate the people. So then, at that time, according to the rabbinic story, many people converted to Judaism, to the Israelite religion, so they wouldn't be killed by the lions. They're called lion converts. So that's the complicated answer to your rather simple question, Stephen. Right? What we can understand is from that first source that absolutely there were those that did convert. There's a famous story or urban tale of the convert that comes to Shammai and Hillel, that lived around the time of Jesus, a little bit before, perhaps, and maybe even overlapped. And when the convert says, "Teach me the Torah, all the Torah," while he's standing on one foot, Shammai chases him out of his hound with his measuring stick. Could be symbolic there as well. When he comes to Hillel, Hillel says, "Don't do unto others as you would not have them do yourself," the inverse of the golden rule. And the rest is just commentary. Now go learn. And so we see there in that story, that tale, that urban tale, that there are two opposing or complementary, if you will, views on proselytization.
Nice.
But then with time, of course, Stephen, what happened was under Islam and under Christianity, even under Roman rule, certainly when Rome became Christian, that was no longer the policy. Proselytization was by and large discouraged. I don't think it happened in large scale, because if Jews were to do that, they'd be in trouble with the ruling culture, the ruling government. There's notable exceptions to that, but there are exceptions that only prove the rule.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
Okay, so we go back to our text, and that comment at the end. How did you understand the thing about the new wine? Anybody? We're back to the biblical text, the Acts text, and at the bottom of the second paragraph, all were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But there were others who sneered and said, "They're filled with new wine," meaning.
Wasn't new wine more intoxicating than the old watered down wine?
Right, or wine that maybe became vinegar already, right? So new wine considered to be intoxicating. But why accuse them of being drunk? Well, to discount the experience. It's not an authentic spiritual experience. They're meshugane, we would say. And this too is based on a biblical scene. Any biblical scene somebody can think of? And if not, go to the third page, go down to number 5. Megan, would you read number 5 from us from the book of Samuel?
While Hannah was praying in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice could not be heard. So Eli thought she was drunk. Eli said to her, "How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Sober up." And Hannah replied, "Oh no, my lord, I am a very unhappy woman. I have drunk no wine or other strong drink, but I have been pouring out my heart to the Lord."
So I'd like to believe, maybe I'm kidding myself too much, maybe I'm too biased, but I'd like to believe that the author or authors of Acts or Luke or whoever they are, they know their Bible. They know they're heavily influenced by biblical stories, and even if it's not a direct interpretation, as we're going to have with Joel, a direct midrash, it's in the background. One of the most beautiful stories that we have of contact between an individual and God, truly beautiful in its detail, because it brings out that tension of a man saying to the woman, "How could you," automatically assuming the worst, "You must be drunk." And yet, of course, that prayer of Hannah, as you well know, that brings about Samuel into the world, and Samuel is a major, almost up there with Moses from a biblical point of view, is of importance. At least Psalms talks of Samuel and Moses in the same way. that the quintessential experience of God having to do with language. In this case, the language wasn't heard. The lips, again that word lip, the lips were moving, the language wasn't heard. The accusation was she must be drunk. The same way that the lyres in the background here were I would imagine that's in the background of the author. What do you folks think?
Sure resonates.
So shall we go on? Move on to the more complicated section. I mean, until now, first of all, all right. Let's leave it for now. Let's go on to the next section. Who'd like to read? So, Jack, you want to read for us from 14? Just need you to unmute.
Pardon me, 14 is what you said?
Yeah, from verse 14, yeah.
Yeah, but Peter, standing with the 11, raised his voice and addressed them. Fellow Jews and all who live in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and listen to what I say. 15 indeed. These were not drunk, as you suppose, for it is only 9 o'clock in the morning. 16, no, this is what was spoken through the prophet Joel. In the last days it will be, God declares, that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Even upon my slaves, both men and women, in those days I will pour out my spirit, and they shall prophesy. And I will show portents in the heaven above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and smoky mist. The sun shall be turned to darkness, the moon to blood, and the moon to blood, before the coming of the Lord's great and glorious day. Then everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Is that enough there, Dave? You want me to read some more?
Yeah, because we're winding up our time soon. But responses to this passage, to Joel, the way it's quoted here, I think we should deal with it first in that way. Is this a text that is this included in the reading in the lectionary as well? This passage. Mm-hmm. So it's a text that the Christians would know.
Yeah. Like on Ash Wednesday and then of course from here. But yeah, what gets evoked for me is, well, of course, the apocalyptic language of the blood moon and all that is like biblical speak for the day we're all expecting is here. We're on the brink of this new age. And so there is anticipation, there's excitement, but also I like this, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh. That evokes Genesis chapter 2 for me, where Adam, earthy, is breathed into by God's own breath and comes alive and becomes, a fully human being. And then, of course, John chapter 20, the Gospel of John, recreates that primal, blowing of the Spirit when Jesus, after his death, he appears behind the locked doors in the upper room, and he breathes on them and says, "Receive the Spirit." So something's happening here, and it's got a lot of biblical resonance for me. And this, of course, is Peter's interpretation of that moment that they're in and what that means. And then it gets interesting, which I guess we'll have to wait for next week, and the way he then interprets that. I think that gets very fascinating and interesting.
Right. The for those that for those in Hebrew, the word neshama, soul, is the same word as breath. Neshima and neshama are the same word, and our thought, and it's in our liturgy as well, liturgical language, that episode in the second creation story when God breathes into the human being, that is godliness, hence the breath and soul, and it's a spiritus, right? It's the same in other languages as well, but it comes out really nicely in Hebrew when you say to somebody, take a deep breath, tinchom amok. What you're saying is, commute with God, right? Just, calm down and bring God into the picture. So, interestingly enough, in the Jewish world, the book of Joel is not well known. My guess is for the Jews amongst us here, it's not a book you were terribly familiar with, correct, Gary? Richard?
Yeah, not,
It's a short book. I don't know if there's a haftarah that is an additional. I should have looked if it ever comes up during the year as the prophetic writing, which is just a section. I had not read any of it until I was in university and had a year-long course just on the book of Joel. It's only 4 chapters. It's fascinating also, but it's very dark. There's the plagues of locusts and stuff like that. But so just to finish off today, what I think might be in the background, which Peter is going to expound upon, in the background is what we find in a relatively late Midrash, number 6 on your sheets. Midrash Tanchuma. It wasn't written down until maybe the 5th or 6th century, so it's relatively late. But it's an interesting work because it takes a snapshot of a sermon in a synagogue. It kind of has the sections, and many scholars believe of all the rabbinic literature that we have, this gives an actual kind of a view of what was happening when the preacher would speak in the synagogue. So this is just an excerpt from it. The Holy One declared, prophecy is restricted in this world to certain chosen ones, but in the world to come, the gift of prophecy will be processed by all human beings. As it is said, and it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh. Your sons, your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. In other words, very much in the background of Jewish thought is, in the time to come, there will be a lot of prophecy. But what I didn't bring today, and I'm not sure we need to bring it yet, because this is not just about possible roots of anti-Semitism. This is also about xenophobia or Christophobia amongst Jewish circles as well. One finds at the time that Jesus lived is that the rabbis will say, since in our times prophecy has been given only to madmen. The way to discount any prophet, and Jesus was not the only one at the time, talking about that aspect of Jesus. Okay, are there any parting comments before we sign off for today, and we'll pick up where we left?
I think what I'm going to do, Rabbi, on my iPhone calendar for this class, set the end date instead of the fall, the end of the decade at the rate we're going. I'm going to add 10 years to the end date.
No, we'll keep going until, Richard, you start to prophesy. Then we'll know we've done.
Okay. Or speak in tongues.
That's great.
Okay, everybody. Lovely to see you. Lovely to be together.
Peace.
Be well. Bye-bye.